Did you know that eating disorders are the leading cause of death among mental illnesses? The South Carolina Department of Mental Health reveals this on their site, along with many other useful statistics regarding these debilitating diseases. Unfortunately, unlike nearly all other mental illnesses, eating disorders are severely underfunded and lack substantial research to turn these numbers around. After conducting copious amounts of research and dealing with this issue firsthand, it is imperative that eating disorders receive the same funding as other mental illnesses in order to effectively combat these life-altering diseases. I, myself, am an anorexia nervosa survivor. Luckily, I was blessed to have access to great doctors, nutritionists, and therapists to help me overcome this illness. However, other victims aren't so lucky. I've witnessed an immense lack of access to essential resources amongst people suffering, as well as an enormous lack of education and research within the healthcare system surrounding this issue, emphasizing the dire need for increased funding in order to promote access as well as knowledge and research. Throughout this speech, I will reveal the devastating facts about eating disorders and why there's such a problem within our society, how we can start to combat these illnesses, and what the benefits of a world with increased eating disorder awareness and funding would look like. So building off of that daunting first fact that I laid out, there are many other jaw-dropping statistics surrounding eating disorders and the impact they have on our society. They are much more than diets and lifestyle choices. They are crippling mental illnesses that can even result in death. Anorexia nervosa, one of the most prominent eating disorders, is the third most chronic illness among adolescents according to the National Institute of Mental Health. And in another article published by U.S. News and World Report, for females ages 15 to 24, the mortality rate of anorexia is 12 times higher than the death rate of all other causes of death. Now that's a stifling statistic. And while these facts may seem far-fetched and irrelevant to your life, Eating Disorder Hope Online estimates that nearly 11 million Americans suffer from eating disorders in the United States alone. And of these people, 4 in 10 people have either personally experienced an eating disorder or know someone who has. So while these may seem irrelevant from your life, it's very likely that you've come in contact with someone who's had an eating disorder, or you yourself could even have an eating disorder. And just as astonishing as these statistics are the statistics surrounding federal funding for eating disorders. The Academy for Eating Disorders reveals U.S. federal funding for eating disorder research is an estimated $28 million. As opposed to alcoholism, which is $505 million, schizophrenia with $328 million, and sleep disorders with $187 million. To put that into perspective, eating disorders receive 93 cents per person in comparison to the average $70 per person among all other mental illnesses. Now this is crazy. With eating disorders having the highest mortality rate of any other mental illness, funding further research for these diseases is imperative in saving more lives. So this is where you all come in as U.S. citizens. In order to turn these numbers around and decrease the number of eating disorder diagnoses and deaths, we desperately need to increase funding for this mental illness. When we increase federal funding for these mental illnesses, we enable doctors and researchers to dig deeper into the potential causes, solutions, and stigmas surrounding eating disorders. The lack of funding seen with these diseases is partially due to the culture in which we live. The emphasis on appearance in our society is so exaggerated and unattainable that it leads people to take drastic measures to meet those ideals, even if it means sacrificing their own mental health. The fact that we trigger these diseases through our own culture makes us think that eating disorders are less serious and more of a lifestyle choice, rather than a severe mental illness. Stigmas associated with eating disorders are also a major factor in the epidemic, causing people within the disease to be ashamed, embarrassed, and oftentimes in denial that they need help. All of which can be eliminated through education and increased awareness, stimulated from further funding. When certain questions are answered through research, we'll be able to more effectively treat those suffering. If we can answer how genetics affect eating disorders, what role weight stigma plays, and how we can catch these diseases earlier, along with a plethora of other questions, we can greatly lower the mortality rate and diagnoses associated with eating disorders. Some say this kind of solution won't work, that funding should be put towards other disorders, and eating disorders are vanity illnesses and lifestyle choices rather than mental illnesses. However, after living with anorexia nervosa, I've witnessed the debilitating effects of this disease and the dire need for increased awareness and education. Imagine if we can cut that number of 11 million eating disorder victims in half. Imagine if we can save those adolescents from suffering and eliminate those mortality rates. Imagine if we can urge someone who struggles with binge eating or starvation habits to get help because they are no longer ashamed and instead informed. After conducting copious amounts of research and dealing with this issue firsthand, It is imperative that eating disorders receive the same funding as other mental illnesses in order to effectively combat these life-altering diseases. We can no longer afford to sit around as millions of Americans suffer from these illnesses. We need to end the negative stigma surrounding eating disorders and educate the public now. We need to provide answers, and we need to lower statistics. If we don't increase funding, the mortality rate will increase as well. People will continue to silently suffer, and people will remain undiagnosed and uneducated. With more funding comes more research, which provides more answers to save more lives. And as Derek Shepard says, it's a beautiful day to save lives. So let's do our part in saving lives today.